Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for inviting me to give this prestigious lecture. It's marvelous to be on your beautiful campus and to see its many students and supporters here in this audience. And in particular, I should say how appreciative I am of that nice introduction, Tom, because it puts me in mind of one I received a number of years ago when I was lecturing in the Soviet Union. My host on that occasion, who I like to think had an imperfect command of English, introduced me by saying, Professor Dallek is the author of several distinguished works. They're the kinds of books that once you put them down, you can't pick them up again. Not music to the author's ears. I like to precede my lecture with another anecdote, which I think is quite apt in the context of my discussion tonight, in particular of John F. Kennedy's medical history. And this involves my son, who is now 34 years of age, but when he was about 4 or 5 years old, he said to me one day, Daddy, he said, you're a doctor, aren't you? And I said, well, yes, but not like your doctor, not like your pediatrician. He said, oh, I know that, because you're also an historian. Well, I was delighted that he can make this distinction at so tender an age. But then he wanted to know, does this mean that you make people in the past feel better? That's, I guess, what's known as a methodological breakthrough. Let's see if I can make John Kennedy feel any better tonight. Kennedy is a fascinating character. I find all these presidents I write about and spend years with such arresting figures. And Kennedy, I think, maybe was even more arresting than any of the others, though Franklin Roosevelt certainly would have given him a considerable run for his money. Kennedy enjoys extraordinary popularity, not just in the United States, but around the world. When you ask Americans, as the newspaper USA Today did, shortly before my book came out in May, they asked the cross-section of Americans, who is the greatest president in American history? Rank. Give rankings to those who you see at the top of the list of presidential greats. Abraham Lincoln came in first. John F. Kennedy was number 2. Now, this has been happening, going on, for almost 40 years. Poll after poll, Kennedy is seen as somewhere in the top 3 or 4 of the greatest presidents in American history. In 1990, there was a poll. He had an 84% approval rating, the envy of anyone who serves in the Oval Office. The mystery for professional historians is why. How could it be? He served in the office for only 1,000 days. His was the 6th shortest presidency in American history, the 3rd shortest in the 20th century. Only Warren G. Harding and Gerald Ford had briefer presidencies than John Kennedy. And yet, he has this extraordinary hold, not just on the public in the United States, but all over the world. I was just in Germany lecturing at the Frankfurt Book Fair, in Munich, in Berlin. The response to Kennedy there is mind-boggling. He's an icon. There's an exhibit of his life at the Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin. And the crowds that flow through there. In June of this past year, when it was the anniversary of the Berlin Ich bin ein Berlin speech, Friends told me that all day long, television in Germany was captured by the images of Kennedy in Frankfurt, in Berlin, giving his speech, touring the country, and that there's a kind of ongoing love affair. Historians are deeply puzzled by this. First of all, they point out not only did he have a very short tenure in the White House, but there's also the fact that his domestic programs were never enacted during his lifetime, during his presidency. Civil rights, the war on poverty, which he talked about, Medicare, Medicaid, federal aid to elementary, secondary, and higher education, an $11 billion tax cut, setting up departments of transportation and housing and urban development. Not a single one of those measures was brought to fruition during his lifetime. And on civil rights, historians have been very critical of him. He dawdled, they felt, they feel. He did not respond to the burgeoning crisis of the early 1960s. He lacked the sensitivity, it's been said, that Lyndon Johnson, that Hubert Humphrey had for this civil rights issue. And so professional historians argue, how could he be a great president if he had such a barren domestic record? And what about foreign affairs? Can one see him as such an extraordinarily successful president there? After all, he was the architect of the Bay of Pigs invasion, which failed miserably in April of 1961. And after that invasion, he walked around for days saying, how could I have been so stupid? Chiding himself, full of recrimination over the fact that he had unleashed the Cuban exiles to try to topple Castro's regime. Not because he didn't want to topple Castro's regime, but because it was such an ill-conceived and unsuccessful plan. Also, historians complain about the fact that Kennedy, many of them believe, was the architect of a disaster in Vietnam. When he came to office, there were 650 American military advisors in Vietnam. When he died in November 1963, there was some 16,700 military advisors. And Lyndon Johnson, following on what Kennedy had done, expanded the war, produced a bombing campaign, Rolling Thunder, in March of '65, escalated in July of '65 by putting in 100,000 combat troops, and said repeatedly, I am simply doing what President Kennedy would have done. And there are some historians who are convinced of that, and they also, as a consequence, are quite critical of Kennedy as president. In addition, historians are sharply critical of him for his womanizing. They point out that he was a world-class philanderer, that he said to Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, at a meeting in Bermuda, if I don't have a woman every 3 days, I get a headache. And he carried on indiscriminately with a woman who was alleged to be tied to mobsters, with a woman named Ellen Romish, who could be accused of having been an East German spy. We don't know if she was. There's no evidence to prove that. But even the appearance of such impropriety would have been enough to sink his presidency. It was reckless. Historians, biographers have complained repeatedly that his self-indulgence was a mark of bad character, was a demonstration of thoughtlessness on his part, and that he jeopardized his presidency and the national well-being by being so self-indulgent. Finally, in this bill of goods, so to speak, against Kennedy, there is the medical history, which of course I have contributed mightily to now by uncovering the truth about his medical condition. I applied to a committee at the library for access to medical records which I knew had been locked up there for 40 years. Other biographers, journalists, historians, scholars had asked permission to read the materials, and it had been consistently denied to them. But after 40 years, they agreed to open the material to me. Happily, there were no preconditions set on my use of the material. And I knew the minute they rolled those archive carts into the archives room, where a medical colleague and I were prepared to study these records, I knew I had hit pay dirt. Because normally, presidential archive boxes are trimmed in red and gold and blue, and these were old cardboard cartons. And when we opened them up, what we found instantly was that Kennedy had been hospitalized 9 times between the spring of 1955 and the fall of 1957. That he suffered from a variety of diseases that if the public knew about this in 1960, it's my conviction that he never would have been elected president. He had, as a boy, something they called then spastic colitis. He was sent to the Mayo Clinic, where he went through a battery of difficult, painful, embarrassing tests. We know this because we have access to letters that he was writing to his prep school pal, Lemoyne Billings. And here's Kennedy, he's a 17-year-old kid. Nobody from the family was with him at the clinic. And this is a life-threatening disease. And the guy had an extraordinary sense of humor. He's writing, describing what they're doing to him about these tubes they're running up his quote-unquote arse, as he wrote it. And he says, I can only tell you that this morning my rectum and I are not on speaking terms. In 1937, this was 1934, in 1937, steroids first became available. His father, extraordinarily wealthy man, one of the wealthiest men in America, was able to purchase these drugs. Kennedy began taking them. They didn't have a dose. And the steroids caused him to have osteoporosis of the lower back of the lumbar spine. It was always said that his back difficulties were the consequence of a football injury in college or the result of the PT 109 episode, but in fact it was caused by taking the steroids which caused the osteoporosis. We had 10 boxes of x-rays, and my medical colleague was able to show me the compression fractures that he suffered as a consequence. The man was in constant, miserable pain. He couldn't roll over in bed at night. He couldn't reach down and pull the sock and shoe on his left foot. He couldn't go up a staircase the way a normal person might. There were photos of him being lifted in a cherry picker to get on Air Force One so that he would not have to climb the stairs because of the agony of his back problems. In addition to the colitis and the terrible back misery, he had something called Addison's disease, the failure of the adrenal glands. This was caused also by the taking of the steroids. There was an inherited component. One of his sisters has Addison's disease, but apparently it was the steroids that principally precipitated this. And he was so ill that three times he was given last rites before the actual death in 1963. He had to take cortisone medicine, hydrocortisone, What I found was that during the crises he passed through as president, he had to take additional tablets, shots, to deal with the tension that he was under when he gave a speech, when he held a press conference in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. He was also on something called testosterone. This was not to heighten his libido. He didn't need that. It was because of the colitis he kept losing weight. And there are charts of his weight in the records showing the fluctuations, up one day, down the next. And the testosterone was given to beef him up, hold up his weight. However, it also drove up his cholesterol. And he had readings of 410. Often it was in the 300s. The lowest reading I saw was 276. People have asked me, would he have lived out a second term? Probably. But how much longer he might have lived is very difficult to know. So in addition to the back problems and the colitis and the Addison's disease, he also had what's called prostatitis, urethritis, sinusitis. He was a walking medicine cabinet, one might say. They hid this from the public. There was a cover-up. There was a systematic and very effective attempt to cover up his medical failings. During the 1960 campaign, at one point, the medical kit that he carried with him was misplaced. And he called up Abe Rivercutt, the governor of Connecticut. He said, Abe, a medical kit I normally carry with me has been misplaced. We need to find it. It could be murder if it fell into the wrong hands. They did find it, but it was just one measure of the cover-up that they practiced. And so one can say, in terms of his length of service, in terms of his domestic record, his foreign policy record, his history of reckless womanizing, his medical history, why should historians, why should the public, more to the point, see him as a great historian? I'm sorry, he was a great historian too. He did write some terrific histories. Why should they see him as a great leader, a great president? And the second question is, was it merited? Does he deserve to be remembered as a highly effective, even great president? Let me try and answer, or give you my answer to those two questions. Why does the public see him as so extraordinary? Well, first of all, of course, there was the assassination. He was martyred. But this is insufficient to tell us why the public has this love affair with JFK. After all, William McKinley, who was a popular president in his day, who was elected to 2 terms, was assassinated in the fall in September of 1901, and 40 years after his death, hardly anybody remembered who he was. And yet here we are, 40 years later, and Kennedy is and continues to be something of an American icon. What's more important, I think, even than the assassination, is television. Is the fact that the tapes of his press conferences, the fact that he is kept alive in our memories at the age of 46. He was the first one to hold live televised press conferences. People told him not to do it. They warned him that he could slip, step, missteps, there could be blunders, and that as a consequence, he could jeopardize his administration and jeopardize national security. But Kennedy knew that television was his ally. Indeed, he knew this from the first debate he had with Richard Nixon during the 1960 campaign. People who watched or listened to that debate on the radio were convinced that Nixon had won. But people who watched the debate on television saw Kennedy as the hands-down winner. Kennedy, so vital, so young, so intelligent, so charming, so charismatic. And Nixon, alongside of him, somebody said, looked like a sinister chipmunk. He was tired, getting over an illness, gaunt, terribly thin, and Kennedy looked into the camera. He didn't debate Nixon. He spoke directly to the country about what he would do if he became president. Nixon, being a very effective debater with a long history of debating skills, tried to debate Kennedy. And in a sense, Kennedy would have no part of it. And it gave him a real advantage with the public over Nixon in that debate. And so Kennedy, knowing how effective he could be on television, held these live televised press conferences. And we have them to this day. And you can see his wit and his charm and his charisma. It comes across with extraordinary strength and force. What people can't imagine is that last May 29th, he would have been 86 years of age, you see. But he's frozen in our minds at the age of 46. If you ever go to the Kennedy Library, and I would go there 3-4 days a week, and every time I walked in, you look up, and there is this huge poster of JFK looking down on you, charming, engaging. It's as if you have a dialogue with him when you walk in there. And every time I walked in there and looked up at that poster, it gave me goosebumps. See, made me almost feel connected to him. I teach undergraduates in a course on the American presidency. They don't remember Ronald Reagan. They're 20 years of age. Reagan is not part of their memory. But when you talk about John Kennedy, they come alive. It's as if they knew him. It's as if they have some special connection to him. And I think so, the assassination and television and the image that's conveyed are enormously important in giving him this continuing hold on the public. But there are other things. Ethnics, ethnic Americans, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Jewish Americans, French Canadians, you mentioned it. I went back and looked at the voting data, and they voted for Kennedy in huge numbers. Franklin Roosevelt brought ethnics into the mainstream of the country's political life. He appointed Joe Kennedy ambassador to Great Britain, and he chortled over the idea that he was sending, as he said, this red-headed Irishman to the court of St. James. Gave him a kind of perverse pleasure. He brought ethnics into his administration, but I don't think the ethnics felt legitimized or fully accepted into American life until Kennedy became president. He was not only the youngest man ever elected to the White House, he was, of course, the first Catholic elected to the White House. And he broke a taboo, so to speak, which no longer exists. Does anyone in this country, for a minute, raise the question of whether somebody is a Catholic anymore who's running for the presidency? Kennedy changed this. And I think to this day, ethnics have a kind of appreciation of that, a sense that he gave them a kind of full acceptance into American life. And so, the assassination, his TV image, ethnics, all contribute to this affection that people have for him. Why doesn't the medical cover-up bring him down? Why doesn't this really say to people, gosh, the man lied to us, he deceived us, he misled us? As I said before, I don't think he could have been elected president in 1960 if people knew about his medical history. And yet, I find there's very little recrimination over this. In fact, what people tend to focus on is not the cover-up, but their sense that Kennedy was extraordinarily stoic and heroic. They look, for example, at the fact that here is a man with all these ailments that I described. And yet what did he do? He went to the United States Navy in World War II. The initial assumption of his family, and of Joe Kennedy in particular, who helped him get around the medical board that was to examine him. In fact, Kennedy tried to get into the Army, the United States Army in 1940, and was rejected because of his health problems. Then he tried to get into the Navy and was rejected again. And so he turned to his father, who had, of course, connections, and they set up a physical for him that ignored his real illnesses and gave him access to a commission in the Navy. The assumption was, there'll be no danger here. He went to Washington, D.C., where he joined the office of ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence. But his father and mother and the family did not calculate the fact that he was not content to sit on the sidelines after Pearl Harbor. He pressured his way into the most glamorous part of the Navy service at that time, the PT boats, made glamorous by the fact that they had taken MacArthur out of the Philippines and rescued him by getting him to Australia. And Kennedy joins this service, goes out to the Southwest Pacific. It was an act of extraordinary courage, it seems to be. Those boats would ride so rough in the water. And one of his shipmates described how Kennedy would need to sleep on a board at night because his back was causing him so much pain because of the rough conditions in which he was living on those boats, see. And then his boat is cut in half, and he rescues his crew and wins a medal for his extraordinary heroism in the face of this danger. He also had a wonderful sense of humor. Later, some young man asked him, how did he become a hero in World War II? He said, oh, it was very easy. A Japanese destroyer cut my ship in half. He was someone who made light of this heroism. But in fact, I think the public now sees him as all the more heroic because he dealt with these medical problems and served as president. The $64 question, which I posed to myself and others have asked me since, is what would have happened if he had some kind of terrible medical affliction or attack during one of the great crises he was managing? The Bay of Pigs crisis, the Berlin crisis that lasted for a year and a half, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I set his medical records down alongside of his handling of these crises. And we have, of course, for the Cuban Missile Crisis, these very detailed discussions on tape of him speaking with what's known as the ExCom, the Executive Committee, about how to deal with the Soviet danger in Cuba. And what you find there is that the man was as cogent, as lucid, as you'd ever want a president to be in such a crisis. It may well be that when he went back to his private quarters at night, that he was a bit somber, that he was not fully in control. But during every one of the crises that he passed through, and I studied these records alongside of the crisis, and I found him to be as effective as possible. Now, some people, critics, have come after me and said, this is absurd what you're saying. He was on all those medicines. How could he be all that effective? Why, look at what happened at the inauguration. He gets up there and he takes his coat off. It's freezing cold. Look at the pictures closely, the TV tapes again. He's sweating. And my response is, so what? So what if he's sweating? Did it diminish the brilliance of the address? I think it's one of the 4 great inaugural speeches in American history. Did it diminish his presentation of the material, his delivery of that speech? Not in the least. I happened to be driving along in Washington where I live and had the car radio on, and they were replaying speech, and I found it thrilling, as I did the first time I heard it. And so I think the public, in many ways wisely, has discounted these medical problems because I don't think they did have a significant impact on his conduct of the office. Don't get me wrong, I don't think we'll ever want to do this again. And I don't think we'll ever be able to do this again. Kennedy made a bet that he could be an effective president. And he won the bet. He carried it over. But no candidate for the office today could get away with this. The media, it's so changed. The media would be on their case instantly. They wouldn't be able to cover it up. And I think that's all to the good. We should know as much as we possibly can about a president's physical and psychological health before we give him the keys to the Oval Office. Nevertheless, on the medical count, Kennedy passes muster with the public as well. What about the womanizing? What about that? Was it reckless? Yes, I think it was in significant part. And particularly what I found disturbing was what I uncovered about the 19-year-old intern that he was having an affair with. Now, as I said earlier, please don't rush out to buy my book on the basis of this intern story. There are only 38 words in the book about this, 2 lines. But I found it compelling to put it in, on the one hand, because I was so puzzled. Why in the world would someone as attractive, as successful, one might say, as a seducer, why did he have to carry on with a 20-year-old intern? There was some compulsion here, something that was driving the man that is beyond full comprehension. Oh, I think the fact that his father was a world-class philanderer was part of it. I think the fact that he knew the British aristocracy. He had spent quite a bit of time in England when his father was ambassador, and he saw British aristocrats who had wives, children, and would go away on weekend for trysts. They were philanderers. Thirdly, I think he believed he would not have a very long life. And his older brother was killed in the war. His youngest sister was killed in a plane crash. And so his approach to life was carpe diem, seize the moment, live life to the fullest. And I think this is part of the explanation for his womanizing as well. But there's something deeper here which I don't quite understand. And maybe it will take a psychiatrist to explain it. I can't fully explain it. And yet, does the public care all that much? Doesn't seem to. For 30 years now, the media, biographers have been revealing these affairs, his womanizing, and it doesn't seem to bring down his reputation, you see. I think in some ways people find him even more glamorous as a consequence. And I think it's interestingly related to Bill Clinton. Because Clinton, who gets caught out by the media, lies to the country about it, is embarrassed, mortified, impeached, but not convicted. And a majority of the public do not want to see Clinton kicked out of office. And I don't think they would have wanted Kennedy kicked out of office either. Because somehow or other, they see this as a private transgression, and that's one thing. It's not Watergate. It's not a violation of the Constitution. It's not ethical. One can certainly not describe it as ethical. But somehow or other, the public doesn't take it as reason to see Kennedy as someone they lose regard for. 2 other things. Domestic affairs. His record was down, as I said. But on the other hand, we should consider the fact that every one of his major initiatives, be it Medicare, aid to education, the war on poverty, the Departments of Transportation and HUD, the tax cut, civil rights, every one of those initiatives became law under Lyndon Johnson. And 100 years from now, I think historians will look back and see the Kennedy-Johnson administrations and see these domestic reforms, these important, major, lasting domestic reforms, as the consequence of Kennedy initiative and Johnson follow-through. And so one might say that he should get significant credit for having pioneered, introduced, major transforming domestic legislation. Foreign affairs, his greatest moment, of course, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. We know now that we came this close to a nuclear holocaust. The fact is that we now have access to Soviet records. They were prepared to use missiles. They were prepared to use nuclear weapons if we bombed and invaded Cuba. The military was pressing Kennedy to do this, and he resisted. He wouldn't do it. He relied on diplomacy, and he succeeded. Kennedy was profoundly skeptical of the American military. Indeed, he watched them during World War II in the Southwest Pacific and wrote letters home complaining about the naval chiefs he saw out there. After the Bay of Pigs operation, he was bitter at what he felt was the very bad advice that the CIA and the military had given him, encouraging him to believe that Castro would be toppled by a popular uprising. And so when it came to the Cuban Missile Crisis, he followed his own lead, his own instincts. There's a fascinating tape of him speaking, which is available at the Kennedy Library. He's talking to 3 national security advisors, and he says to them, you know, these fellas in the Foreign Service and the Diplomatic Corps, they have no cojones. No cojones. Now, these guys in the military, they have cojones, but that's about all they have because they don't have any brains. I'm not making it up. You can listen to this yourself on tape. He was deeply skeptical of following their advice. His greatest achievement, I feel, was averting a nuclear war. In the 1960s, there was so much talk about fighting a nuclear conflict. Limited nuclear war was the catchword as a counter to the Eisenhower-Dulles massive retaliation. Kennedy listened to his military talking about this at one point, and he walked out of the meeting and turned to Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, and said, and we call ourselves the human race. He was chagrined at the possibility that human beings would ever engage in such a disastrous conflict. And he worked diligently, effectively to avert it. And of course, he did put across the limited nuclear test ban treaty as a demonstration of his concern about this. Finally, in foreign affairs, one can ask the question, well, what about Vietnam? Are the allegations of historians that he would have gotten us deep into the big wadi the way Lyndon Johnson did, that failing war effort in Vietnam? I think not. I don't believe that Kennedy ever would have done what Johnson did with Vietnam. He saw the Americanization of the war as a terrible mistake. There's evidence. In 1962, he asked Bob McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, to begin laying plans to get the military advisors out of Vietnam by 1965. His last conversation about Vietnam was with the Assistant Secretary of State for Far East, Mike Forrestal. And he told him in November of '63, as he was about to go off, Kennedy was about to go off to Dallas, he said, Mike, when I come back, we need to review this issue of Vietnam entirely, including the question of how we get out of there. There's a wonderful memo from him to McNamara dated November 5, 1962, 7 days after the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The memo is a response to one from McNamara describing invasion plans for Cuba. We didn't know if Khrushchev was going to pull the missiles out of Cuba, and so there's still an invasion plan on the table. Kennedy said to McNamara in his memo, Bob, the invasion plan is very thin. Think of the technical capacity they have. Think of the nationalistic fervor we meet if we go in there. And let's not forget what happened to the British in the Boer War, what happened to us in North Korea, what happened to the Russians in the Finnish War of 1940. Quote, he said, we could get bogged down, unquote. Now, if he's worried about getting bogged down in Cuba, you can imagine how he felt about Vietnam. We'll never answer the question fully, what could he have done, what would he have done? But one last fact about this that's of keen interest to me. When you look at the polling data, public opinion polling, Gallup polls, 1961, 62, 63, there are no Gallup polls on Vietnam. It wasn't an issue. That was front and center. The first Gallup poll you find on Vietnam is in the spring of 1964, and at that point, 37% of the American public is saying that it's paying attention to Vietnam, only 37%. Lyndon Johnson hated the press because he felt it was demoralizing the war effort by its negative reporting on Vietnam. Kennedy was at odds with the press corps in Saigon because they were reporting critically of what Americans were doing there and how our policy was not working. What Kennedy feared was not demoralization, but that these reporters and newspapers were going to force the issue onto the front pages of the newspapers and put pressure on him to escalate in Vietnam, which is something he didn't care to do. And so I will say to you that if he had lived, I don't think we would have seen the kind of war in Vietnam that we experienced under Lyndon Johnson. I don't want to suggest that if Kennedy had lived, we would have had utopia. There would have been lots of problems. There always are. The inner city riots, I think, would have been there as well. But there's something about Kennedy that recommends him to the public and to young people to this day, which I think is going to be there for a very long time to come. Franklin Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln are remembered for saving the Union. George Washington for setting the nation on its way. Kennedy is remembered for having given the country a kind of hope, a vision of a better time, a better world, a better day. He spoke of a new frontier, of putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade, a Peace Corps, and lines for progress. He asked not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. He spoke to our better angels. What he provides, I think, is a sense of unfulfilled dreams, of unfulfilled hope. And there's a kind of mythology which attaches to him now. But countries, democratic societies need myth, and he fills that bill. His death, which I don't think the country has gotten over yet, and then the death of his brother Robert in 1968, and then 4.5 years ago, the death of his son, John Jr. It all speaks to this same feeling of lost opportunity, lost hope. And he's held fast in our minds as someone who maybe could have given us a better America, a better world. And Americans are optimistic. They like that. They want that. There's a wonderful anecdote which I'll conclude with. Ted Sorensen, his White House counsel and speechwriter. Ted Sorensen tells the story that after Kennedy died, some people said to him that they felt Kennedy's death more than the deaths of their parents. And Sorensen thought this was the case because when their parents died, they lost a piece of the past. But when Kennedy died, they lost a part of the future. And I think this is what people attach to this day. A better America, a better future for the nation, for the world. Somebody will be here 50, 100 years from now, and my speculation is, we'll all be gone, or at least I will. They'll be talking about Kennedy in these sort of iconic ways as well. Anyway, thanks for being so attentive to my long talk, and I am happy to answer questions.
If you have any questions, we would ask that you come up to one of the two microphones. So please do so.
I just have a quick question. Joe Kennedy favored or earmarked John Kennedy to be president. Is it because he was older than Robert? He should have picked the healthier one, the younger one. Why was he so promoting of John?
Well, there was a kind of pecking order, so to speak, in the family. And the one who was designated to become president, well, Joe, of course, wanted to become president himself, but he never could, because he had a reputation for being an appeaser, someone who had sided with Neville Chamberlain during the 1930s in the run-up to World War II. And so he saw his son, Joe Jr., as the one who would succeed to the presidency. And of course, Joe Jr. was killed in the Second World War, 1944, and so the mantle fell on Jack. At first, Jack was not terribly happy about it. He was a rather shy, cerebral sort of fellow. He liked the idea of writing books. He had thoughts about being a historian, a journalist, see. But he came to love politics. He loved the give and take. He loved the campaign trail. And of course, his enjoyment of it rested on the fact that he was brilliant at it, you see. He could get before an audience and sort of wrap them around his fingers. And he was just absolutely superb at this. And so the father, who was a very intelligent and effective sort of leader of the family, saw what Jack's promise and talents were. And Bobby was too young. You know, there was quite a gap in their ages. And Bobby was too young. I think there was an 8-year difference. And so Jack running in 1960 is just 43 and becomes the youngest man ever elected to the White House. So Bobby, they hoped Bobby would eventually succeed Jack, see, that he would come along and be part of this dynasty. Well, some people have been asking me, do I think the Kennedy dynasty is alive and well? Will it give us another presidential candidate in the future? Well, as a historian, I guess I should act like a prophet, but who knows? But they are engaged. They are a dynastic family, so to speak. They do have a hold on the public's imagination. It doesn't guarantee anything. The Robert Kennedy's oldest daughter, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, she took a terrible thumping in Maryland when she ran for governor. I think her career is over. But there are lots of Kennedys, and down the road we may see another one running for president.
This question tends to focus more on like JFK/Cuban Missile Crisis. How much of Kennedy's opposition to both Cuba and Castro was actually personal, if any at all?
It was actually personal on what?
It was personal, like his opposition to
Yes.
Cuba and Castro was actually personal.
Yes. Well, Kennedy learned a lot from that Bay of Pigs operation, because it wasn't personal to that point, you see. This was an Eisenhower plan. He was skeptical of it. but he went along with it. The Kennedys didn't like losing, especially Bobby. And after Castro, so to speak, trumped them, or beat them over the Bay of Pigs operation, it did become personal for a while. And they set up something called Operation Mongoose. The idea was they were hell-bent on toppling Castro. But you know, by the last months of Kennedy's presidency, to his credit, he understood that the Cuban policy had reached a dead end. And as a consequence, there were back-channel discussions going on with Castro's government about the possibility of a rapprochement. Again, we'll never know if it would have happened. If Castro insisted on our evacuation of Guantanamo, I don't think it could have happened, but there were conversations going on, and it spoke to the fact that Kennedy stood back. He had a capacity to remove himself, to get a certain detachment. And presidents and great political leaders always need that. Franklin Roosevelt used to say that he never thought about the day's work. When his head hit the pillow, he went right off to sleep. Reagan would say that too. And it's a real virtue for, I think, a president, since if they twist and turn all night long over their decisions, they're not going to be very happy chief executives. So Kennedy did have a certain attachment.
You raised in your beginning the issue of civil rights, and you really didn't deal with it in your conclusion and your positive spin on Kennedy. Would you further elaborate on that?
Sure. Kennedy was very, I would say, derelict in the first 2 years of his presidency on civil rights. Just simply did not respond all that strongly to the issue. It was a calculation on his part. He wanted to get these other reform measures through that I mentioned, and he thought if he did not agitate the Southern congressmen and senators who were chairmen of so many crucial committees, that maybe on civil rights, that is, maybe they would be more forthcoming on things like federal aid to education and Medicare and the tax cut. He was wrong. Didn't happen that way. And so in 1963, when the Alabama crisis erupted with George Wallace, Kennedy came to understand that this was an issue whose time had come. He could no longer avert it, ignore it. The television pictures of the young African-American boys and girls, young people, marching and being beaten by the Birmingham police, by the state troopers, disgusted him, outraged him. And it was also political calculation at work here. He was fearful that riots would be touched off across the country if he didn't do something, and that we were mightily embarrassed before the world because the Soviets were beating on us as a racist society. And so he gives a speech, which is largely an extemporaneous speech in June of '63. I think it's one of the 3 great speeches of his presidency, in which he says that none of us will be free until all of us are free, and that he celebrates the African Americans who are struggling for their rights now as heroic. And he was putting his presidency on the line in many ways because the opinion polls at the time were not that keen on dramatic civil rights reform. But he came around. He saw the wisdom of the need to do this. So I think in the final analysis, he should get good marks there. And then, of course, Lyndon Johnson enacted that civil rights bill in 1964.
Good evening, Tony White, Washington Post. This question is for Dr. Dallek. How much credit would you give to Kennedy's Brain Trust for any of his accomplishments? What role did he take with the Brain Trust? And part 3 would be, did any of the members of Kennedy's Brain Trust want to do anything particularly remarkable after the administration?
Sure. Well, Kennedy did have a brain trust. He did have very intelligent advisors. He elevated Maxwell Taylor, for example, to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He didn't like the other military chiefs, for the most part, he was dealing with, and he had faith in Taylor, so he put him in that position. Matt Bundy, National Security Advisor, Walt Rostow, chairman of the Policy Planning Council of the Department of State. Lyndon Johnson, his vice president. Bobby Kennedy, his attorney general. Rusk, secretary of state. McNamara, secretary of defense. He saw these men, and notice I say men, there were no women, only men. He saw them as brilliant, thoughtful, sensible, but he always followed his own lead. He made his own judgments. He listened to them. He valued what they had to tell him, but he made up his own mind. It was something he learned very early on, and it was something that his father encouraged him to learn. The father understood. The father was so rich, so powerful, so famous. The father understood he could have crushed the intellectual and emotional life out of his sons. And he didn't want to do that. And so he encouraged them to think for themselves and develop a kind of independent spirit. And Kennedy had that. Now, after Kennedy's death, of course, most of the people I mentioned went on to serve. Lyndon Johnson served for a long time, some with greater distinction than others. People like Rusk and McNamara and Bundy and Rostow all had their careers blighted by Vietnam. Others who were involved in the domestic matters gathered a certain amount of glory over the fact that all the Kennedy domestic initiatives were enacted under the rubric of the Great Society by Johnson. But I think the basic point here is that Kennedy did think for himself. He was nobody's minion. He was nobody's puppet. He just had a very independent approach to advisors, to policy. This isn't to say that he was right on everything all the time, but he did think for himself.
Dr. Dallek, I noticed that you mentioned Jackie Kennedy, and I was wondering, don't you think that she had a tremendous influence on his image and his legacy?
But Jacqueline Kennedy is a very interesting figure. One of the reasons I haven't mentioned her is because of my frustration over the fact that she is in some ways a shadowy figure. I don't know if I mentioned this here or just earlier. There's a 500-page oral history interview that's locked up in the Kennedy Library, and it's not to be opened until 50 years after her death. I think when that's open, we're going to learn a great deal more about her, and a great deal more about her feelings. On the one hand, about her husband's womanizing. She knew that. There's no question. I was told an anecdote. They were up in Canada on a state visit, and was a receiving line. And she turned to Kennedy's military aide, and she said to him in French, he spoke perfect French. She said to him, pointing to a woman in the line, "It's not enough you bring this woman up here to Canada for my husband. Now you want me to stand here in line and shake her hand?" So she knew, and it angered her. But did she have a say in the great crises that he was passing through? I think we'll learn a great deal more when that oral history is open. Because she became a person in her own right after his death and had a successful public career, one might say, not as a politician, but as a celebrity. And she did a brilliant job, I think, of raising her two children, keeping them insulated from the press. But I think there's a lot more to be learned about her and other first ladies. And I think also there's an important book to be written as to why so many of these first ladies were willing to sit still for this kind of philandering. Lyndon Johnson was also a world-class philanderer. When they tell him about Kennedy's womanizing, he'd bang the table and he'd say, "Damn it to hell, I had more women by accident than he ever had by design." Very proud of her. Lady Bird knew. She knew. And she was an anchor in his life. And it pained her. It hurt her. See? Hillary Clinton. See? Eleanor Roosevelt. I think there's an interesting study here to be written. So I think we'll learn a lot more about Jacqueline Kennedy in the future.
Dr. Dallek, while you discussed the public's willingness to overlook Kennedy's hiding his medical records, being an expert, what did you and or your medical colleague feel of, was it an ethical or unethical move?
Well, I think it's unethical for a president to hide his, or a candidate for the presidency, to hide his medical history if it is likely to be a serious problem for his conduct in the office. And I think it's impossible for Kennedy to have known that it wouldn't have been a serious problem, since he had such an array of difficulties. Now, people said to me, don't you believe in the privacy of someone's medical history? And I do. I think all of us are entitled to that privacy, but not candidates for the presidency. They have their fingers on the nuclear trigger, the nuclear button, and I think we are entitled to know about their history. I would hope the public would be more sophisticated maybe than it used to be. After all, if somebody suffers from some depression, there are medications which can be taken these days, and also consider the fact that if we knew about the sort of depressions that Abraham Lincoln struggled against, Winston Churchill would complain of his dark dogs that would haunt his waking hours. We might have lost Lincoln and Churchill, and they were great leaders, you see. So I don't think there should be a knee-jerk response to the fact that somebody has medical problems, but I think we are entitled in a democracy to make judgments about this. As for the womanizing, I wish it were left alone. And maybe I sound like a hypocrite because, after all, I'm the one who brought forward the stuff about Mimi. Mimi, she's the 19-year-old intern who formed these 38 words in my book. And as I like to tell the story, maybe I'm naive, but the day this was coming out, the New York Daily News called me up, and the reporter said to me, I want to ask you about this intern, this Mimi. I said, well, how do you know that? They said, well, Nightline has done an interview with you, and they are featuring this Sunday night on NBC, and we have it. And I said, oh, well, what do you want to know? And he asked me, who is she? I said, I don't know. I wasn't told. I didn't want to know. She's a woman with children and grandchildren. I didn't want to embarrass her. But my source, I felt, was entirely reliable. I trusted her. So I went with the story. And I said to him, by the way, I said, are you doing a story about this? And he said, man, welcome to the world of tabloid journalism. For the next 4 out of 7 days, the New York Daily News ran front-page stories about Kennedy's Monica. As I said earlier this evening, on page 3 of the New York Daily News that Monday, there was a picture of Monica and me. And as I told my wife, I never met the woman. So, I mean, that's a long-winded answer to your brief question.
I've got a couple of questions, but you mentioned the kids in your class and how much they have an admiration of Kennedy and not Reagan. But yet, in your synopsis, you didn't talk about Kennedy's influence in terms of service and his influence on bringing people into government. I felt that there was a similarity when I was in 4th grade. President Kennedy was assassinated, and his brother Robert, a few years later, and their call to service was a big deal. And I felt that they may have been influenced by FDR as well in terms of their call to service.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And I think you're absolutely right that Roosevelt created a sense of involvement in the government and public service. Joe Kennedy was very shrewd. When the Depression came along, he said to his sons, the next generation of big people in this country are going to be not businessmen, but people in government. See? So you want a career that's gratifying, that's overarching, so to speak, and that commits you to public service. Also, of course, the Kennedys, like Roosevelt, had this sense of noblesse oblige. They were born to the purple. They had a right, in part because they were American aristocrats, but they had an obligation to serve. And I think the Kennedys have conveyed that to young people, and to this day, of course, we have a Peace Corps, which still functions and still serves a wonderful purpose around the globe.
I have a quick follow-up. Is there truth to the rumor that Humphrey was actually his idea with the Peace Corps, or is that not accurate?
Well, it was in the air, and Humphrey did talk about it, but it was Kennedy who seized upon it, spoke about it during the campaign in Michigan, and then, of course, translated it into a real program.
Hello. You mentioned about how Kennedy was the first Catholic president.
Yes.
My question is, how did his faith, if at all, impact or influence his presidency?
It's hard to believe in 1960, such a important issue. There'd never been a Catholic as president. There were constant attacks on the idea if you had a Catholic, he would not be loyal to the Constitution and to the government and to the public. He would be, first of all, a Catholic loyal to the papacy. Now, Kennedy took this issue head on, and he wins a limited victory in Wisconsin. There were a limited number of primaries in 1960. He wins a limited victory in Wisconsin, and he understands that he's got to fight to win the primary in West Virginia, because this is a state with 96, 97% Protestants. And he confronts the issue head on, and he says to audiences, my brother Joe, who was killed in World War II, no one asked his religion when he went on that dangerous mission and lost his life, you see. And then after Kennedy gets the nomination, he holds that famous meeting in Houston, Texas with a group of Protestant ministers, and he carried it off brilliantly. Because in essence he said to them, my faith is a private matter. It will not have an impact and influence upon my conduct of public affairs. And I think that is exactly what happened during his presidency. And it was so successful that nobody now asks the question, is someone a Catholic? You see? There are still other barriers to be overcome in the running for the American presidency. Most significantly, I think, to get a woman. I think there'll be an important development in this country in the next 10, 15, 20 years. I think we'll see a woman as president. I don't know that she'll be all that much better than any man, but it will serve the country marvelously by dint of the fact that we will double the pool of talent we can turn to in a presidential contest, in the nomination contest. And that can only be good, because isn't that what this country's about? Possibility, opportunity, hope. Let's have a woman president, is what I say. She can't do worse than these men.
We'll take one more question from each side.
Thank you, Dr. Dallek. I really enjoyed your presentation this evening. Well, my question is, like, besides his foreign crisis and his domestic crisis, he had a personal family crisis about a couple months before his assassination. It was his death of his infant-born son, Patrick. Do you think, how did he handle that crisis? Would that probably curb his recklessness, and did it strengthen his relationship with Jackie?
Well, I think he was very private about it, and he was fatalistic. They had lost another child earlier on, and I think it did in some ways tighten the bonds between them. But he was someone who understood that human tragedy was part of the human experience. And at one point, when people complained about the fact that there were some people in the military and that they were going off and could lose their lives, and he said, life is not fair. He said, people go in the military, some serve in Alaska, some in Europe, some go off to Vietnam, some in the Middle East. He had a kind of philosophical approach to the world. I don't think it reigned in his womanizing. The man had a capacity to compartmentalize. So when it came to these public issues, he could look at them square in the eye. When it came to these private matters, and what also allowed him to do it was the fact that the media was so different then. It simply did not report upon a president's private behavior the way in which the media does now. So he compartmentalized. But he did have a kind of, he suffered, but no one suffered more than his brother Robert after Jack's death. He suffered terribly and could not understand. And he was a man of very keen faith. And he could not come to terms with why. He kept asking why. Why was Jack taken from us? He just couldn't square it up.
As we approach the 40th anniversary of the assassination, what is your feeling on the assassination? Did Oswald act alone, or was this a plot by others? Had you uncovered any new work in your findings?
I thought I was going to get away tonight. I came this close. But you can't escape it. Thank you for asking. Everybody always wants to know. I don't think there was a conspiracy. I think the best book on the subject is by a man named Joel Posner, P-O-S-N-E-R, called Case Closed, in which he refutes the conspiracy theories. What I also say is that, you know, if there were a conspiracy, these conspirators were very clever fellows, because we haven't found out to this day who they were. And if they were so clever, why would they have been so foolish as to rely upon someone as dysfunctional as Lee Harvey Oswald? So I don't think there was a conspiracy. Kennedy would have understood this. Life, history, are so fortuitous. You know, he was wearing a back brace, as he usually did, the day he was shot. And if he weren't wearing that back brace when that first bullet struck him below the collar line in the back of the neck, it undoubtedly would have knocked him over. And then the second fatal bullet that tore into the back of his head never would have found its mark. See? And so you have this circumstance. And the FBI and CIA and the Secret Service, why weren't they looking at Oswald? Their attention was fixed on the right wing. See? They were afraid of a right-wing attack in Dallas. But Oswald, who came from the left, why didn't they look at this guy? He had been living in the Soviet Union. Fair play for Cuba. He bought a rifle, an Italian World War II rifle that was sent to him by mail order. The Warren Commission report has defects. But it basically, I think, is right that Oswald was the only killer. But the defects have fanned the flames of suspicion. I know 75% of people in this country to this day believe there was some kind of conspiracy. They cannot accept the idea that someone as inconsequential as Oswald could have killed someone as consequential as Kennedy. It's too difficult for people to accept the proposition that life events can be so random. There has to be some organized purpose, explanation to all this. But I'm a believer in something called chaos theory. And I think that's the way the world works. And the best laid plans of mice and men, and dare I mention it, Iraq. Can we master that situation? We're up against such a difficult complex of events now. Can we master it? It's so hard. All our power, all our strength. Could we master Vietnam? Johnson used to complain, damn it to hell, he said, those little guys in black pajamas running around in the jungle. We are the greatest power in the history of the world. And we couldn't master that circumstance. Doesn't mean we won in Iraq, but we're up against, we always are. Human engineering, social engineering is so difficult. We are in the dark ages in so many ways in this regard. Maybe in 1,000,000 years from now, the world will be more rational. People will act with greater rationality. I don't know. And then again, maybe human beings will do themselves in. I tell my students these days, when they take my course, they can't sue me for their psychotherapy bills if I depress them too much. But it's a historian cynicism coming out. So forgive me, you touched both